Hi, my name is Angelo Lopez. I'm a Filipino American editorial cartoonist in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I have the honor and pleasure today to speak to Robert Ragsac and Tom Izu. Now, Tom will be giving us a historical background of Pinoytown, Japantown, and Heinlenville, Chinatown, and a little description of the three communities in those areas. And then after that, Robert will be giving us some of his stories of his experiences growing up in Pinoytown in the 1930s. But before I do, I just want to thank both of you. It's a big honor to be talking to you both, and thank you
yeah.
for taking the time to talk to me.
Sure.
Thank you very
Okay.
much.
Labor of love.
Okay. So now, I guess first, Tom,
Sure.
give us an introduction on the historical background on Heinenville, Chinatown, Pinoytown, and Japantown, and just the three communities that lived in those three
Yeah,
areas.
I'd be glad to. So I think most people, when they think of San Jose, Japantown, they think it's just about Japanese Americans, Japanese culture. But it's actually, historically speaking, it's not just this one group. Its origins is actually in the story of the three communities have overlapping history here in this one place: the Chinese of Heinlenville, Chinatown, the Japanese of Japantown, and the Filipinos of Pinoytown. It really is an Asian American story that links together the impacts of exclusionary immigration laws, the creation of de facto segregated areas in our city, and the forced removal and attempted erasure of community histories. The neighborhood we currently are in really holds the history of these three major Asian American communities, and especially in their formative early years in our valley between 1870 and the beginnings of the 1950s. There are three main things to keep in mind while trying to understand this particular space and how these histories mix together of these three AAPI groups, and how it became what historian Connie Youngyu calls a home base for all three. So the first one is the impact of the anti-Asian movement and the restrictive immigration laws and policies it created. The second is the growth of agriculture as a primary economic engine that drove the development of San Jose area and required cheap farm and canning industry labor. And the last one is the de facto segregation that concentrated these groups, businesses, social and cultural life here in this one location. So let's start with Heinlenville, Chinatown. The Chinese first came here during the California Gold Rush in 1849. The numbers greatly increased throughout the 1850s through the 1860s, especially as Western European powers undermined the sovereignty of China, causing much upheaval and leading to large numbers of Chinese trying to leave for the U.S., with some 50,000 Chinese living in California by the 1870s. So Santa Clara Valley attracted a lot of Chinese because the agricultural industry desperately needed laborers because of the growing value of farming and then eventually canning. It had 5 different Chinatowns here in San Jose, which most people who even grew up in this area don't even know that. But the largest one was on Market Street in what is now downtown San Jose, approximately on the side of what is the Signa Fairmont Hotel right now. I think there's about 2,000 Chinese Americans living in that hotel at the time. I mean, not the hotel, in that space, the Chinatown at the time. It became a target of growing virulent and violent anti-Chinese activity, the anti-Chinese movement. By 1887, the city leaders, elected officials, business people, wanted the Chinese out of San Jose so they could redevelop the downtown area. In May 1887, the Market Street Chinatown was burned to the ground by an act of arson. Heinlein, a German-American landowner and businessman who had done work with the Chinese, told them that he would build a new Chinatown for them, and he happened to have land in the space that we're now at, now called Japantown. But back then it was outside of the downtown area and was kind of like in the boonies compared to the downtown area. This area that he built became known as Heinlenville, Chinatown. He did that in the same year, in 1887. He built a wall around it, and he built all the buildings out of brick because he wanted it to be not easy to burn down like the last one was. It had all sorts of businesses and services in this one little area. And it also had a very important temple called the Ningxinggung Temple that drew Chinese from miles around. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 ended immigration from China and led to an overall decrease in the number of Chinese. In Heinlenville began this process of decline due to the numbers going down of the Chinese. And then the Great Depression of the 1930s, the Heinlein family went bankrupt. And this led eventually to the end of Heinlenville, Chinatown. The city began to demolish its buildings, and the last structure on the original site, the Ningxinggung Temple, was destroyed and removed 1849. So the listeners to this podcast, I really encourage them to go to Heinlenville Park, which is right in Japantown, and there's a lot of educational markers and displays there that talk more about the history of this very significant Asian American community in San Jose. Now about the Japanese. Beginning in the early 1900s, Japanese immigrants became the next cheap labor source recruited to replace the Chinese because the agricultural industry kept on growing and growing and expanding. It's hard for people to imagine when you grow up here in Silicon Valley that the main economic engine that really determined all the different things that happened in this area was agriculture, not technology, not any other kind of industry, was agriculture. So as the number of Chinese declined, the number of Japanese went up because they were being used to do all of the farm labor, to do all the farm work, and to do all the work that the Chinese had done before them. The Japanese immigrants found Heinlenville, Chinatown a safe space. It was a segregated area, but safe for them to continue to set up their lives here in San Jose area. And they began to expand. They had their own businesses right next to Heinlenville, including shops, churches, all sorts of other activities. And as the Japanese population increased, a lot of them actually lived outside of this area, but they used Japantown as their home base to come and do things with the churches and the businesses that they needed. And also I should mention that the existing Chinatown businesses actually helped the Japanese Americans because the merchants there were willing to give loans to the Japanese, which they could not get anywhere else. As they became more and more successful doing farming, truck farming, some of them were able to actually own land. They became the target of a new anti-Japanese movement, especially in the 1920s. Just as the Chinese had before, they ended up becoming the target of this very pretty violent movement. And I'll give you an example of this. During the 1920s, a very well-known local leader named James Phelan, former mayor of San Francisco, a U.S. senator, owner of the famous Villa Montalvo estate, built his political career on attacking Japanese with a campaign slogan, quote, "Keep California white," unquote, emblazoned on his campaign signs, along with various claims that the Japanese were taking over California and they would be repopulating and taking the space of all the white people. He even had a political cartoon done that showed him kind of manning the ramparts of this wall to keep out the Asian hordes. And that actually was kind of a slogan that they had is, build a wall to keep these Mongolians, I think they call them. He meant the Japanese in this particular case out. In 1924, the Immigration Restriction Act was passed, and this cut off immigration from Japan, and then also lowered the number of available laborers that the agricultural industry needed. So the next group that came in to take the place were the Filipinos. There's a lot more to talk about Japantown, but I think we can get at that later. But the Filipinos came in, and they became the next main source of labor, doing almost all the different kinds of farm work, orchard work, canning work that the other Chinese, Japanese had done before. And the development of this Pinoytown happened right on 6th Street between the declining Heinlenville and what at that time was an expanding Japantown. So these three groups actually have this overlapping history, very significant. And it really is an Asian American story, which I think is really important, that a lot of people who come here to Silicon Valley just have no idea that this was here. And the significant role of these three groups have played in the agriculture and continue to play here in the city of San Jose. There's a lot more to talk about Heinlein, all areas, especially Pinoytown, because I didn't talk much about that. But because we have Manong Robert here, who is this treasure of our community. I'd really like him to spend as much time as he'd like sharing the stories.
Sure.
He actually covers a lot of the experiences of the Japanese Americans in Japantown, as well as the Chinese here, and of course the Filipinos of Pinoytown.
Yeah.
So,
As a political cartoonist, I want to apologize for that particular cartoon. I guess that.
Oh,
no,
wow.
we need the right kind of political cartoonist.
No, okay.
I'm glad you're doing that.
Sure.
Yeah. Well, Manong Robert,
Sure.
since you grew up in Pinoytown, tell me about your what was it like?
Yeah, sure. But let me go back to amplify Tom's story.
Yeah.
In a lot of my conversations about the Asians, a lot of the question came up was, why are the Asians here? The quick answer is the Asians are here because the Americans were there.
Yeah.
Now go back to the 1800s, right? When the expansion by the U.S. government, what I call the manifest destiny, did not end at California. It crossed the Pacific, right, through the U.S. naval forces in China,
Yeah.
right, and therefore in the Philippines, in Japan. Yes. But they learned about, because of that, they learned about America.
Yeah.
And what was the vision that was painted at the time? Land of opportunity, you know, the golden opportunity for Asians to make their way here. So that's why a lot of them, particularly the Filipinos, because of the Filipino American War.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of the missionaries and the educators in the Philippines painted this vision and dream of America. So as Tom says, in the 1920s, Filipinos started coming here.
Yeah.
And then where would they go? Well, if you're a Filipino or an Ise, for instance, as Tom mentioned, where would they go to shop? They would go to Heinlenville. And the Filipinos came later in the 1920s, and they suffered the same thing. Where would they go without all the racial discrimination? They would go to Heinlenville. And Heinlenville, for Connie Young Yu, was known for 3 businesses: restaurant business, laundry business, and the gambling business.
Oh.
Now, of the 3, which one was most important to a lot of the Asians? Okay, so that's why Heinlenville became a destination for the Filipinos. Now, the very first Filipinos that came was what they called the contract workers, or sacaras, in 1906. The Hawaii Sugar Planters Association recruited Filipinos to work on the plantations. So 15 Filipinos, mostly Ilocanos, came to Hawaii. Okay, of those, of that wave, then subsequent waves came to work in the plantations, in the sugar and pineapple.
Yeah.
My dad was one of them. So he came to Oahu in 1924 because he was a contract worker, a sakara. He worked in Ola'a plantation until his friends in Waimea sugar mill in Kauai wrote to him and says, "Come over here." This is his town mates. So he went to Kauai. That's where he met my mom.
Oh.
This pretty Pinay from La Paz. My dad was from Santa Catalina, Ilocosur. My mom was from La Paz, Abra. So the reason I'm saying that is that it is a model for a lot of the Filipinos. But those who were fortunate to marry, like my mom, they came here because of the land of the Golden Promise. Right?
Yeah.
Particularly, in my dad's case, his brothers were already here. My dad was Sergio. His brothers were Leoncio and Burnaby Ragsac. So that's why that is a stream that you can see through the years of the Filipinos coming to America. There's a reason why, and that's the dream that was painted, right? Same thing with the Ise, first wave Japanese, and the Chinese.
Yeah.
Now, when the Filipinos came here in the 1920s, my dad came here in 1927. They went just like all the Ise, the first generation. Filipinos came and they went to Heinlenville, right over here, on 6th Street, between the Heinlenville at the time was between 6th Street and 7th Street, Jackson and Taylor, that area. So if the Filipinos went to patronize the shops there, they saw that they can most likely locate, get residents, set up a business, because it was an area where there was going to be less discrimination. So they were able to establish themselves. So what is that? That is the beginning of the foundation. What I now call Pinoytown. It was not called Pinoytown at the time, but it was an enclave of Filipinos. But it was an enclave and included, as Tom mentioned, the Ise and the subsequent generation of Nisei, second generation, the Chinese who were already there, and then the Filipinos who started migrating. So you see the three waves that occurred of the Asians. So fortunately, my dad located here, and I was born in two blocks in a house from here on 4th Street, as a lot of my generation did. So because the Filipinos were located in or close to Heinlenville, Chinatown, or what was then called just Chinatown, a lot of my generation, of course, we grew up in this area, and many of us became real close because of the way it was situated geographically with the Filipinos at the time, the Filipino families.
So the three communities got along.
Yeah. Now there is a what I call the rainbow neighborhood in the 1930s, when early 1930s, even though Heinenville went bankrupt, the Chinese businesses were still there, still operating. Some of them, many of them moved from Heinenville proper onto 6th Street. So here you are in 1930s. Now there's an influx of Filipinos, so they saw that they could establish businesses there, or they can get rentals, boarding houses. So you have the basis where you have an overlap of the later Chinese who had not moved out yet, the Japanese who had their businesses, as Tom mentioned, there on 6th Street. They have businesses elsewhere, but mostly at the time, as I understand it, focused on 6th Street. And then you have the Filipinos there. So this occurred in the 30s. So you had what I call the melding and interaction of the three ethnic groups without, as far as I understand, without any major conflicts. Because when you are suffering under the white oppression at the time, you feel a kinship because everybody hated the Chinese, right? All the whites. And because you're Asian and you have the different color skin, Filipinos were hated too, and they were oppressed. So, but during that period, 1930s, which I like to call a rainbow neighborhood. I should say the reason I call it the rainbow neighborhood is that I drew up a map of 6th Street and identified all the locations of Filipino, Chinese, and Japanese residents and businesses. In order to distinguish them, I color coded it. So the Japanese were magenta, the Chinese were blue, and the Filipinos were brown. When you look at the map that I wrote, you can see the multiple colors. And it just struck me. I said, man, that's almost like a rainbow neighborhood, right? So 1930s, you had this multi-ethnic group, a multi-ethnic enclave that had no conflicts among them. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't any conflict within each group, which has occurred. But in general, they got along reasonably well. And it's an era where I called it diversity without design. Right? It was, nobody came in and says, we all must get along together.
It just happened.
It just happened. That's right. So there was nobody from outside, no anthropologist saying that this is a nice enclave. All of you folks ought to be able to get together really well.
And you had friendships across all three, all.
Oh yes, particularly as amongst the second generation, the Nisei kids, the second generation,
Yeah.
my generation, and the Chinese kids.
Yeah.
Not so much the Chinese kids because by that time a lot of the Chinese had already left, but there were still some here.
Okay.
So amongst our generation who grew up in this area, the three ethnic groups, my generation, the Chinese and the Nisei kids, yeah, we all got along really well. But I have to go back now. I'm talking about the 1930s, right?
Okay.
So up to 1939 to 1940s. So what happened in 1941? On the 7th of December, 1941. So that caused a big uproar. Now, as far as I know, and I can recall, there was no conflict among the Filipinos here and the Ise and Nisei in this area. There may have been, which I don't know, but as far as my sisters and my generation can recall, there was not that kind of a conflict here. There was in other Chinatowns like Stockton and Sacramento, Vallejo, and San Francisco. There were conflicts between the Filipinos and the Japanese at that time.
Okay.
But as far as I know, there wasn't here.
Is it because the second generation thing? Because they're more Americanized?
Well, that could be. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I would suspect that because from the 1920s through up to the 1940s, those three ethnic groups had to live amongst themselves here because of the surrounding area was all white dominated, and you didn't want to go outside of your little geopolitical enclave. So it's a case where what I like to say is because of the boundaries, this conceptual boundaries of racism created by the whites, it caused this Chinatown or Pinoytown and ultimately Japantown to exist.
So it's sort of sink or swim.
Yeah, right. Well, I like to say that following Tom's conversation is that there's a bunch of ifs that led up to what, in my case, for Pinoytown, my interest area, Pinoytown. If the whites didn't burn down Chinatown and Market Street, if Heinlein, a white German immigrant, for crying out loud, did not offer his land to the Chinese, there would be no Heinlenville. If there was no Heinlenville, where would the Japanese go up? The Ise. And if there was no Heinlenville following the Ise, where would the Filipinos go?
Robert, if I can add
Sure.
a story that Connie Young-Yu, the historian, has shared with both of us. And her father, I believe, was born in Heinlenville. I grew up in Heinlenville.
Yeah.
So what she said years later, when she was visiting with her grandmother, she got the story from her grandmother, I believe, about how back in those time periods you're talking about, that there were Chinese there, and there was a Japanese neighbor behind them, and the grandmother would have a basket, and she would put vegetables she grew from a garden, bok choy.
Oh yeah.
And she would pass it over across the fence to the Japanese, a woman who was probably like an Ise, like Robert is described them. That's like the first generation immigrants. That would be like my grandparents' generation. And she in turn would take the vegetables and put some tofu in it, and the basket would go back to her mom, even though they didn't speak the same language, or probably very little, if any.
Yeah.
So Connie, as a young girl, asked her grandmother, why did you do that? You guys, there was a war going on, because Japan at that time had invaded China, I believe.
That was.
And the story she got from her grandmother, I believe, was that, well, yeah, but that's over there. We're here.
Yeah.
We're neighbors, and this is our life here, basically, and paraphrasing it. But I think she was trying to explain that they had a very practical relationship, like,
oh yeah,
this, we got to get
that's a
along
great
here.
story.
Yeah, isn't it? Because it's without words or without having, and so there's all sorts of interesting things that happened here like with Robert's stories, which is I'm going to allow him to talk more, and then Connie's stories, because there are all sorts of things happening that seem really contradictory. But that's kind of what I think Robert's trying to get at. Like this whole
cool.
neighborhood was created, right? And so of course it's created on this whole contradiction of, yeah, we need you here, you're laborers, but we're going to treat you like really badly. So, and you're American, no, you're not American. I mean, all sorts of contradictions. But we had to, people, our whole communities had to grow up under that. And they somehow, this very particular part that Robert is really important to hear his story was a very unique period, right, in the 1930s.
Oh, yeah, it was. In fact, let me add to that. Remember when Connie brought up that story, her dad lived at 655 North 6th in the 1930s. So when I did this colorful map, you could see that where John Young, her dad, lived, there was we identified who the next door neighbor was, a Japanese family. I forgot the name, but surrounding that group was Filipinos' own stores. And in fact, for the period we were talking about, which I'll have to go forward, but I'll come back to it, is my uncle worked for Japanese-owned laundry on 6th Street, but he subsequently moved it. Where he moved it was close to where John Young was located. So I would like to believe that because of that activity, those kinds of relationships, that my uncle and John Young must have crossed paths. But anyway, those are the kinds of stories that amplify what is the diversity without design. It happened that way. Now, of course, you have to remember that the whole reason why the Filipinos were able to stay here is because of the agriculture. So the 1930s, with the Chinese and Japanese laborers and the Filipinos, they created what was then called the Valley of Heart's Delight. Remember that, Tom? Yeah. So they created the basis for the world-renowned Valley of Heart's Delight, the agricultural center of at least the West Coast. And it was because of those three field laborers, those three ethnic groups. So maybe I'm getting off. All right. So
this is a
so let me
I
add
was going to ask you how what was their work and stuff, and you're explaining it right now. It was mostly agriculture and cannery? Is that it?
Yes. The in the 1920s, it was mostly field workers, right? And then many of the Filipinos at that time, in the who were the first wave, what we call the first wave Filipinos who came in the 1920s, they either worked in the fields or the service industry. They're busboys or cooks, but most of them, particularly here, were Ilocanos who worked in the fields. Okay, my dad was one of them, and my uncles.
I guess was it the third? This was during the John Steinbeck Grapes of Wrath period, right? Was did you guys have to worry about Okies and stuff? Did they come here or no?
There's an interesting story about that. I guess it could be edited properly, but maybe I should say something. That's a facet that I just discovered not too long ago. The Dust Bowl era, 1920s, I think it was. The Dust Bowl era was the 20s or 30s.
30s.
I think it was the 30s, right? So a lot of the people from Oklahoma, now called the Okies, right? Migrated west because they saw that California was probably better than wherever they were in Oklahoma. So they settled in the Central Valley. A lot of them settled in the Central Valley. Okay. Well, there were a lot of Filipinos working in Central Valley. Well, all up and down the California Central Valley, as well as along the coast. So now you have this white families who came from the poorest conditions possible, right? And the women were there too, suffering from the same thing. There's the Filipino workers there. Now, if you're a Filipino who's 19, 20, or 25 years old, You're looking, and you don't have a Pinay,
Yeah.
so you're looking for a woman.
Yeah.
Right. It turns out that a lot of the Filipinos saw, and the women saw that this is the way for them to escape their condition
Yeah.
by marrying or getting close to or being girlfriends with the Filipinos,
Yeah.
the Filipino boys. However, because of the anti-miscegenation laws,
Yeah.
Filipinos couldn't marry a white.
Yeah.
Right? So they had to either, I think it was Arizona, or you had to go up to Washington, I think it was, or Oregon.
Oh, to get married.
To get married,
Oh,
right? Yeah, and then they would have their family share. So there, you'll see that in a lot of the histories of the Filipinos in Central Valley, or in a lot of other areas, that there are mixed marriages. And many of them are white. There's great pictures of the Filipino taxi dancing.
Yeah.
And I saw the picture. I don't remember where it was. It might have been Stockton.
Yeah.
And you look at this picture, there's a gathering of in the taxi dance halls.
Yeah.
There's a lot of white women there with the Filipinos.
You know, this leads to a question I had. In 1930, in Watsonville, there were anti-Filipino riots because Filipinos danced with white women and stuff.
Yeah.
And I know up and down the West Coast, there were incidences of anti-Filipino violence and stuff.
Yeah.
Now, how did you witness this, and how did it affect Pinoytown?
Well, as far as I know, the only effect on Pinoytown and the Filipinos here was that, of course, when in the Watsonville riots, and it was a full-up 2 or 3 day riot.
Yeah.
And the whites were invading the camps, the campos.
Yeah.
In one of those invasions, a Filipino named Fermin Tobera was shot and killed. Okay, that incensed the Filipinos here. They were ready to go down and support the Watsonville. But I think it was Leo Escalante, owner of the Manila Pool Hall, saw that was not a good idea. And so he gathered as many Filipinos as he could and invited some of the civic leaders here in San Jose to talk about the responses that the Filipinos wanted to do for the Watsonville riots.
Yeah.
And especially when their countrymen like Tobera was shot and killed. Well, they were able to cool down and tamp down the fervor. So there, as far as I know, none of the Filipinos here were engaged in supporting the Watsonville Filipinos. Now, there's a whole story about the Watsonville riots, and the guy to talk to is Roy Ricio.
Oh, okay.
He's the one that has created this program called Watsonville is in the Heart.
Oh,
and it's about the Filipinos families, and he's recording, capturing and documenting the Filipino family stories there. And of course, a lot of that was based on the fact that at the time, because of the hatred, he wanted to capture the families, that historical event, keep up the memory of Fermin Tobera, and then document the family histories of the Filipinos it's actually the Pajaro Valley. So as far as I know now, none of the Filipinos here were involved in that. Individually, they may have, but I don't know that.
Yeah, for me, there's a lot of irony in that because I'm married to a white woman from Watsonville, so if I was around at that time, I wouldn't be alive for long. But but when I heard the history, I thought, wow, and stuff. I didn't realize how bad. I got a part of it. I listened to Carlos Bulasan's America's in the Heart.
Yeah.
I got a sense of it, but I didn't know how bad it was until I read that book, or until I heard the story about Watsonville. And stuff.
Oh yeah, right. So, Watsonville was one riot. There was another one in Yakima, Washington, and there's the famous Hanapepe massacre in Kauai.
Yeah.
Although it occurred in Hawaii, that's still U.S. possession, and that occurred very badly because many Filipinos were killed, and so were some white law enforcement officers.
Yeah.
So that became, I guess, in the minds of the Filipinos, a symbol of how the whites hated the Filipinos. and that occurred in Hawaii.
Yeah.
But the word got out here, of course, and they knew about that. And that's
Did it make a scary atmosphere and stuff? You know, I mean, you just become afraid of white racism.
well, yeah. And I don't know how the first wave Filipinos felt about it. I only know about how they felt when I overhear them. But they, as far as I know, they did not. At least some of the Filipinos did not let that uh, deter them for what they wanted to be.
Yeah.
They wanted to uplift their family. They wanted to uplift themselves. So they did not get, as far as I know, get involved in things that would cause them to be victims. And if you're a victim, say, "Oh well, the world is against me," "woe is me" type of thing. Well, many of the Filipinos, I think, they ignored it. They went about their business. They had their celebrations. They had their families gatherings. They formed their organizations, and they had mutual support. Just like a lot of ethnic minorities would at that time. So, go ahead.
So I was just going to ask another instance of racism was Executive Order 9066. Now, from what you witnessed and stuff, how did it affect Japantown, and how did it affect your Japanese American friends?
Well, let's see. Tom, did you want to mention anything about 9066 from the?
Let me.
Yeah.
You have a really good story. I want you to share it,
Okay.
if you're willing. But what I try to tell people is, I didn't talk a lot about Japantown and its development, but if you were with us, you could see a very vibrant community. It had all sorts of things: these churches, social activities, businesses, lots of things happening here.
Yeah.
So when you see that and you see what it looks like today, if you could try to imagine within a very short time period, basically, the whole part of the Japanese American part of this area be turned into a ghost town. Within a few days, they're just gone.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to imagine, but it's important for something to think about, because this really illustrates this is what it means. This kind of racism, what it can do, and exclusion, because it seems really abstract, but if you picture that, people are just gone. Talk about displacement of a community.
But that's one of the reasons that's one of the reasons I'm talking to you both, because it's important to have that historical knowledge to be passed down, because it'll happen. It could happen again.
Right. So this executive order signed by President Roosevelt at the time, in response to the attack on Pearl Harbor, was years in the making because of the anti-Japanese movement and things that we already talked about. And then, of course, what it led to eventually was putting Japanese American into U.S.-style concentration camps in various parts. Like my mom was in one in Poston, Arizona. My father did not go to camp because his family moved out of the area before there's a deadline. If you were here, you could not be in California if you had 1/16th drop of Japanese blood, which is bizarre, right? I guess we could figure that out.
How do you figure that out?
I guess genealogically, I don't think they had a blood test.
Oh yeah. That's what I was going to ask.
That was just
how do you figure that out?
That was just the way racism works, And there were people who were like part Filipino who were in the camps. And,
yeah, sure.
Married whites, and they were in the camp. But the point is that this was just a massive removal of people in a very short time, all just based totally on ancestry and their race. It had nothing else to do, because it stuck all these Japanese Americans together in these camps. And they were of all different backgrounds. Some of them were fairly well off before the war. Some of them were very poor. Like my mother-in-law grew up in a labor camp in Southern California. So she calls it kind of like a lateral move into the barracks in a camp. But the point is that they were forced out, and they had pretty much very limited future to look at the time. They didn't know what was going to happen. Like my mom spent her high school years there, and she had no idea.
That must have been scary.
Yeah. So if you think of it that way, the kind of impact that had it on these people, you don't necessarily feel that immediately, but you should just start by thinking of entire community just being emptied out. And then this had a tremendous impact. But it'd be really good if, Robert, you can say how you experienced it. You were pretty young then, right? But you
sure.
still felt it and saw it. So it's really good
you witnessed it firsthand.
Well, yeah. I guess, um, yeah, it was pretty vivid because I remember that Sunday, uh, uh, these guys were yelling, holding newspapers and rolling down the street, hawking the newspaper about Japan bombing Pearl Harbor, right? And I was over here at the Revelo House at 168 Jackson Street. Us kids were all gathering together, and that's when we got the word. That was Sunday, the 7th of December. Okay, I was 11, 40, 41, 10 years old. That was the 7th of December. Monday, the 8th of December, my friend Ed Kimura and I attended Jefferson Elementary School, Hobson Street near First. Uh, Ed and I were really close friends. He lived on 3rd Street, and I lived directly across from the Buddhist temple at 639 North 6th.
Oh, so you were really close.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Right. So normally, as we usually did, I would walk down 6th, walk up Jackson to 3rd Street. Ed Camaro would meet me at 3rd and Jackson, and we both would walk up to the school. That's what we did every day, and every night we'd walk back together. We'd play in the fields for a while, and then Ed would go back to his house in 3rd Street, and I would come back down here at home. On Monday, the 8th of December, we did our usual thing. We met at Jackson and 3rd, and walked onto the playground at Jefferson Elementary School, and the kids started jumping on him. He started crying. So did I. I've told this story I don't know how many times, but it's hard to do. Mm-hmm. But it was sad. Because all the kids were jumping on Ed. I didn't know what the hell why. And then I started crying. But of course, I found out later, why that occurred.
Yeah.
So that's one of the impacts to me. That's one. The other is that we lived at 639. 2 doors from us was my sister Helen's really close friend called Akiko Iwasaki.
Yeah.
So on or about April 42, I think it was, that was the movement, right? Was that right, Tom? April or May 42.
So, yeah.
Yeah. My sister told me, it was a vague memory to me, but after she told me what happened, then it became clear. It became a memory that resurrected. She said that she saw her friend, Aki, and the family going down the stairs out onto the street, carrying all their luggage, their clothes, or whatever they could carry out onto the street, and then started walking down the street. And I don't know what happened to them thereafter, but according to the historian, Curt, they ended up at Tanforan. I think it was Tanforan racetrack. They were bussed up there or in the railroad as an assembly area, and then being transported to the internment camps. Okay, so that was the Iwasaki family. Now there's another instance that is a sort of ironic. That is, one of my dad's friends was Emil Rentar.
Yeah.
And he met, through some association, he met a Japanese gal. She was Nisei, Midori, Murokita. Or I think her maiden name was Kawamura, but her married name was Murokita. She got linked up with Emil Rentar, and she ended up living in the camp in Milpitas with Emil, who's Filipino, Ilocano, and either a distant cousin of my dad or from the same town. He's Ilocano.
I didn't know there was a camp in Milpitas.
Oh, you're talking about a labor camp?
Yeah, a labor camp. I'm sorry, it's a ranch.
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
That's right. Yeah, and then so they got together in 1941 or so, But in 42, she was forced to leave. Um,
Yeah.
her parents were left, forcibly moved out, but she was stayed in the camp. It's called a campo in Filipinos, which is a ranch.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
so she stayed there with Amo and hid there until she was found out by someone, I guess, told the sheriff. So they went and arrested her and Amo. Well, they deported um, Midori to a camp. She ended up in Topaz,
Utah.
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
Topaz, Utah.
Yeah.
Right. Amo stayed here, but Midori was pregnant. So in Topaz, she gave birth to a boy called Eugene. Now, because she was in camp, she did not want anyone to know that it was a Filipino uh, and in fact, the relationship was probably pretty secret, and she did not want anyone in the camp to know. But she gave birth to this Filipino boy, Filipino Japanese.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. His name was Eugene Rentar. Eugene Morokita in camp.
Yeah.
Now his dad in 1943 or 44 was able to get uh, one of Midori's friends to help transport the baby to San Francisco, where he was able to get legal guardianship over his biological son.
Yeah.
Right? So that's one of those kinds of stories about what happened under 9066, the executive order.
Yeah.
The ones that I know. Now, the other thing that was sort of graphic to me is that, remember I talked about the rainbow neighborhood,
Yeah.
the three colors. So 1941 and 42, you could see the rainbow neighborhood. In 43, when the census was taken by the city, all the magenta colors were gone, which represented the Japanese. Because a lot of the buildings were abandoned, a lot of the Filipinos, or many of the Filipinos, saw that either took over an existing business like a restaurant. I think it was almost complete. Um, I think it was the one of the Filipino families um, took over one of the cafes, the restaurants. Gee, I can't even think of the name. Holy smoke! And um, Universal Cafe. It was taken over, and a lot of the other empty boarding houses, the Filipinos came in.
Yeah.
So during the war, there was very few Chinese by then, and there was quite a few Filipinos that owned residences along 6th Street. They were either businesses or residences or organizations. Maybe I should mention that two of the organizations that were very prominent officially existed was the Caballeros de Masalan, which is a fraternal organization, and then the other is the Gran Oriente Filipino, which is a true Masonic lodge.
Oh. Okay.
And and those organizations were formed during the 30s.
Oh.
So they maintained their existence through the 40s.
Did they have like secret handshakes and all that stuff?
Well, in the Masonic case, yes,
Oh,
most likely, because they were true Masons.
okay.
Right, in the structure of the true Masons, or what they call the Freemasons.
Okay.
As far as I know, the Caballeros de Masalang was a fraternal organization. It's a brotherhood.
Oh.
So a bunch of guys who get together and provide self-support, help the other communities,
Yeah. Yeah.
raise funds for various purposes. Those are what I call the well-known organizations. The others that were formed were what I call the townmate organizations. So if you were from Santa Catalina, for instance. So there was a organization called the United Sons of Santa Catalina.
Yeah.
There was one called the Kabugao Sons for the Philippines from Kabugao. The other was Lapog Sons, if you're from Lapog. And there probably were some others that I can't recall right now. But so you can see that amongst the various organizations, there was groups that were associated with the Masalang, the Grande Oriente, but they were all part of the larger Filipino community, the community of Filipinos.
Yeah.
Which and
Did those civic groups help, kind of like, with strengthen the community, I guess?
if you're talking about civic groups like the city of San Jose,
Oh no, like the Masons, the Filipino groups.
well, they were yeah, they mutually supported each other to the extent that they're willing to, based on, like in the Masons case, you get, because of the nature of the Masonic order, they're very secretive.
Yeah, I don't. Right. I know nothing about the Masons.
Yeah, look that one up.
That's why I'm asking. Yeah. I'm kind of curious.
The Dimasalang was more of a fraternal organization. Like I said, they were just a brotherhood. And they were really outgoing. They supported a lot of the activities. They had celebrations. Same thing with the town-made organizations.
But they're like, I don't know, dances.
Oh yeah.
Or like baseball games, basketball. I mean.
Well, most of the social activities was fundraisers, dances, queen contests, national holidays, like they'd celebrate Rizal Day.
Okay.
Yeah. Filipino Independence Day. Yeah. That kind of thing. Okay. So, and now I should say that in the 1930s, the Dimasalang and the Grande Oriente Filipino were very prominent because of that time at that time. Also, the town-made organizations too. So that was in the 1930s. Now, during the war in 1940s, even though the Filipinos were occupied a lot of the buildings, the residences, and businesses, many of the Filipinos had joined the 1st and 2nd Filipino Infantry Regiments or the U.S. Navy.
Yeah.
So the population had declined by the number of bodies. The Chinese were very few. Of course, all the Issei and Nisei were gone. And so it was just the Filipinos in my generation here at that time.
And a lot of them were serving the war.
Yes, right. So you can see that what was a very dynamic interracial enclave during the 1930s and in the 1940s, before Executive Order 9066, that it was pretty much a dynamic, vibrant community. I should say too that when I think it was the 1940s, my brother and I, we were only just 10 or 11 years old, we would go to Chinatown and shine shoes.
Oh.
The Filipinos, that was our little thing. That we went to, because that's you could earn 2 bits.
Oh, okay.
2 bits is 25 cents.
Oh, okay. But I'm guessing back then you could get a lot more.
Oh, you sure can. Yeah. In the 1930s, you could go downtown to the theaters and
watch a movie.
And you get 2 movies.
Oh, 2?
Newsreel, cartoon, and a cereal.
Wow.
Most likely a superhero type cereal.
Yeah.
So if you got 2 bits and you shine shoes and you end up the day with $1 or the evening $1 or $2, then you can spend the whole afternoon at the theaters.
Oh, cool.
So it just the reason I say that is because there was at that time before the war, there was on both sides of 6th Street, there were a lot of Filipinos there, and we would shine their shoes, and we did that until the war occurred, and then that ended that.
So Robert, I was just going to bring up when you were talking about some of the associations and these clubs that organized in the Filipino community. So for Japanese Americans, of course, there was the same. This is pre-World War II, especially.
Yes, right.
So the first generation immigrants had organizations, or based on where they came from in Japan. They called them Kenjin Kai. And they also had a lot of activities, exactly like you're saying too, that were basically what people like to call mutual aid now, that they were set up because they had to do this. And one of them, like we're sitting right behind us is the Issei Memorial Building, and that was actually built, I believe, by one of the Kenjin Kai took the lead on it. It was a hospital for the first generation, Japanese American Issei, because they couldn't get that kind of services with the language and the food in other hospitals. If they're welcome, even.
Right.
And doctors from Japan couldn't practice here, so they decided they had to do something about it.
Yeah.
So this building is very symbolic of that effort. And I could talk a lot more about it in more post-war time period, but just sticking with that time period, you could see all these activities of Filipinos, and what was remaining of Chinese in Heinlenville, same thing. They had these associations that were based on all sorts of different things, rules based on what the club was. There was a lot of effort to take care of people here. That's basically what they were doing, right? I mean, they might have different kinds of philosophies, or some of them were religious-based, probably. But the interesting thing is they were separate, though, too. Like the Japanese had their own, Filipinos had their own, Chinese had their own, so it wasn't like they all mixed together, right? And you mentioned that one interracial marriage. My understanding is that wasn't very common, too, because it's interesting. They were all jammed together here in a way, but there were definitely separations, right? Like generally, they didn't condone interracial marriage, right? Is that right?
I don't until 1967, Loving versus the state of Virginia. That's when interracial marriage.
Oh, yeah. I just mean between Chinese, Japanese.
But amongst the three ethnic groups, right? That's right, Tom. Maybe I should mention that the relationships, even though there was this harmony among the three ethnic minorities, as far as I know, there was no celebration together where the Filipinos and the Japanese would get together to celebrate something or get together.
Okay. There was still sort of like that cultural divide.
Yeah, as far as I can understand it, the relationships were commercial. The Filipinos would go to the Japanese stores or the Chinese stores, or go to the Chinese restaurants, back and forth, So, but it was business, mostly business.
And that business, that interesting part, you have stories about this, is gambling. Because there was a video that Curt Fukuda made. Some of your people were Filipino, probably around your age range, I think. But they were just talking about the gambling scene. And one of the things they said is that one of these young guys at the time, this is pre-war, I think, but he was hired as a bouncer at one of the places that was, I think it was called the
Cabbage Patch.
Yeah. So it was a little bit outside of Japantown. But he said his job was that he had to make sure that only Japanese, Chinese, and Filipinos came into this gambling place. That's right?
Right.
So I thought, well, that's interesting. But when you think about it, it's because Japanese, Chinese, Filipinos, they had everything to lose, and nothing to gain by, ratting out their friends. Like, let's, tell the police or whoever to raid this place, because they were all in it together. Whereas you couldn't tell with anybody else, right? So that was just kind of a form of discrimination they did. But I thought it was really interesting. Like, wow,
I never heard of that.
Japanese, Chinese, and Filipinos can hang out together to gamble. And then Connie Youngyo explains that people think that, Chinese are just really into gambling, but that was one of the only businesses that they could do because they had been forced out of everything else. They couldn't be doing labor anymore. They got, after the railroads were done, agricultural work, there were restrictions on them. There's all these restrictions on people. So that was one thing that in this community that they could have some control over and make some money off of. And so it was business, but it was definitely integrated, which is, I just thought was fascinating. Nobody told me that. I'm not sure that's a story people tell, but so that was going on with all of the Chinese, Japanese in this area, and not right in Japantown. There's stories about all sorts of poker games. That looks like a barber shop. When I was a little kid, we visit my grandmother. I knew there was all these barber shops here, but little did I know, behind the scenes there was something going on, or there definitely had been, right? So it's one of these funny stories that has to do with, they're all together, so they, like you're saying, they did business together, and but it was recreational too sometimes, right? in their theaters that were, not restricted, right? Because
Sure.
you should tell the story if you want to about how as a little boy you got kicked out of all the main things, the temple and the Japanese theater and the Filipino pool hall. I mean, to me that kind of speaks to what you're describing.
Yeah, it's a. I like to say that it's almost like a unintended consequence of the white racism towards the Asians, and that is it forced us to be together.
Yeah.
Right. Otherwise, I mean, you couldn't go outside. The Filipino. I can imagine a Filipino going downtown and shopping
Mm-hmm.
in a white store, right?
Yeah.
Or a Nisei doing the same thing with Chinese.
Yeah.
So they did that here. And gambling, of course, is what I call the common social imperative
Yeah.
in the Asian world.
Yeah.
And so, and who were the leaders at the time? Well, because they were here first, the Chinese, right? And it's one of those cases that I think should be probably told a little bit more crisply, and that is, sure, there was white hatred towards the Asians, but a lot of the consequences helped us grow. The consequence of that. Okay, so we were in this enclave in the 30s and 40s, but then our generation grew up and began to see this hatred. But we said, well, we're not. We're going to go to college, or we're going to or we're going to go to service, or we're going to work at something somewhere else. Not like our parents. We're not going to work in the fields, right? So, and a lot of what I experienced and my generation experienced is similar to what the Nisei kids experienced and the Chinese kids.
Yeah.
So it's one of those what I call the unintended consequences of this anti-Asian hatred.
I'm guessing that my camera is starting to run low on storage. So let me ask you just two more questions.
Sure. Yeah.
One for you. What is your fondest memory of Pinoytown? And for both of you, what advice would you give to someone who wants to learn more about the history of Pinoytown and Japantown? So I guess we can go with you first, and then the more general. I'm guessing my camera.
Oh, okay. You mean we're going? Yeah, that was another one of those unintended consequences. Well, okay. Let me say. Let me answer the easy one first. If you want to know more about Pinoytown, the quickest way to do that is take one of our Pinoytown tours.
Yeah. Okay. How do you do that?
So look it up. Pinoytown tours.
Okay. Yeah. And you do that,
Google.
Right?
Yes, and we do it under two circumstances. One, we get a group of people together and they request. Or we have enough people who individually requested and we get a date together and we conduct the Pinoytown tours. Or we have a formal group from a corporation or a university or a school that has 15 students that want to know about Pinoytown. So if they take the Pinoytown tours, then that's a good basis for understanding why the Filipinos were here in Santa Clara Valley. And then, by extension, then understand the bigger picture of the Filipino migration to the United States, particularly the West Coast, in the 30s and 40s. The fondest memories now I have, it's hard to because there were so many, but the one that I think is probably got us really got me going was working in the fields. My brother and I were working in the fields as part of an Ilocano family. When their dad says we're going to work in the fields, you don't argue with him. So we're going. There's no discussion or anything like that. So our summer times, like a lot of kids in June, come summertime, oh, we're out summertime, this is a vacation. Not my brother and I. We knew that we're going to end up in the fields.
Yeah.
So as a consequence of working in the fields and seeing the tough labor, we decided we're not going to do this. So the short story is, my brother went to college, and he became a certified public accountant and business manager of some big-time organizations. I went to college, went to graduate school, and became a rocket scientist.
Oh,
So
cool.
because of that memory, that changed my life.
Oh, good.
Oh, if you want to find more out about this community, Japantown, Pinoytown, Heinlenville, first I think you should really look up Pinoytown tours, because this is an incredible opportunity to have somebody like Robert
Yeah.
to help organize these tours, to learn from it firsthand, his experiences. No other better way than that. I've learned a lot from Robert. The other thing is just a little behind me, just a couple houses down, is the Japanese American Museum of San Jose. So look it up. They have a website. Come and visit. They have a lot of information. We're also now and then still doing Hidden Histories of San Jose Japantown tours, which uses augmented reality to share some of these stories.
Oh, yes,
That's
right.
also connected to the museum. So there's you can look up Hidden Histories of San Jose Japantown as well. The other group I would recommend you check out is the Chinese Historical and Cultural Project and the Chinese
Oh, yeah, good.
Museum,
Yeah, sure.
History Museum that's in Kelly Park. And you can look up their website, CHCP, Chinese Historical and Cultural Project. And they will have more information about Heinlenville, Heinlenville, Chinatown, as in Japantown here as well. So those are two sources.
Yeah, I might add in a plug for the book Japantown, A Journey by Curt Fukuda and Ralph Pierce. In that book, there's quite a bit of what I had talked about.
Yeah.
And as well as what Tom mentioned. So.
Aren't you collaborating with Curt Fukuda on a book on Pinoytown? I read that in the website.
Yes, that's been a work in progress for like 10 years.
Oh, okay.
Curt is in demand to do a lot of things.
Oh, is he? He's just busy.
I've been involved, just like Tom. We're all doing what I call the labor of love, and then the story, capturing the story of the Ise, first wave Filipinos, and the Chinese.
Oh.
So, yeah, one day I even have an outline, but that's as far as I got for the book.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time to talk
to me. Thank you, Angelo.
Yeah,
no, I think that's really great.
Oh, no, I'm a Filipino American, but I don't know a lot of this history. So I think it's important to learn, because if you don't learn from history, you can repeat it and stuff. And you have a lot of, especially now and stuff, because it's I feel like we're starting to repeat some of the stuff that we forgot and stuff. And so it's important for you to let us know. Don't forget this.
Yeah. My last parting comment.
Oh no, go ahead. Go ahead.
Is that I always say this at the end of a talk when I give to the college kids, particularly college kids. And that is, one, interview your parents.
Yeah.
And video record them. Two, get a family tree. Now the reason I say that is that we're talking about letting people know about our history, right? You'll never know, just like in my case, I never knew that somebody's going to be interested in my story.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry I didn't know that before. Then I would have done more to interview my parents, my uncles, and get their story and video record them, know that. But their history is gone. So I look at these young kids, and I said, yeah, you're 20, 25 years old. You're going to get a degree. You're going to get married. You go to the service. You're going to get a good job or something like that. And by the time you realize it, you've got 3 kids. And you're 50 years old. And somebody is going to ask you, didn't your parents come from? And then we want to get that story. And I've had that question asked to me by university researchers.
Yeah.
And I feel badly because I don't have a real complete story about not only my parents, but a lot of my peer group, the lost generation, or the bridge generation, as we call ourselves.
Well, I'm
that's a caution, and I think through this kind of video, I hope that kind of message gets through.
Yeah, I'm grateful for you, because you guys had to fight for things that I take for granted.
Oh,
Like,
shit.
my a perfect example is my marriage. I wouldn't, I love my wife a lot, but I wouldn't. A couple of generations ago, I would be in jail for trying to marry her.
No, you'd be dead.
I'd be dead. Yeah, I'd be dead, or but it's through your efforts that I take for granted things that you guys didn't take for granted. You know,
Sure, sure.
so
It,
thank you.
and it comes. Well, I guess you're done, right? So I don't want to waste any more
Oh
of your
no, no,
story.
no. Go ahead, go ahead.
But it comes from for me this Asian American studies, which I was introduced to when I went to college. It was just forming my ethnic studies, and that was a big struggle.
Yeah,
But it's kind of coming full circle for me because a lot of the concepts I learned about Asian American studies at the time a little bit abstract because I didn't know much about Filipinos, Chinese, or a lot of the issues that came up. But now, because of people like Robert and other people I met being involved in Japantown, you see that all this stuff is really real. It's not just abstract ideas
Oh,
about
yeah.
what is our history or just memorizing facts. That there was a connection between these three groups.
they're human stories.
That's right, and that's why stories like Robert has are so valuable because it takes it at a different level. It's not just
Yeah, sure,
remember
sure.
all of these things. I mean, you could see the immigration laws and how it affected Chinese, Filipinos, and all that kind of stuff, and internationally what was happening. And you go, wow, it really did happen, like they say when you read these books.
Yeah,
But then
Yeah.
when you get these stories firsthand from people like Robert, you really start to understand what it meant, to imagine what it felt like, and then that really has an impact on. So what can you do about it now, right?
Oh, yeah.
I think
Oh,
so because
sure.
that's kind of the next step from you should document your own personal history, and then once you do that, you learn these stories. It could affect how you can have empathy for other people and understand how you're better connected
yeah,
to other people. And so, like that cartoon or I mentioned with James Phelan, I saw that a while back, and there he is sitting behind this wall he built, and they're saying he's the man. He's going to protect us from the Mongol invasion. And he was talking about Asian. He was talking about Japanese at the time that cartoon was done.
yeah.
And so you look at that and you go, this is a while back when I first saw it. And there was somebody running for president at that time, and guess who it was? And what was he saying? Build a wall, build a wall. And you go,
Yeah.
oh, is that similar? Nah, totally different. And same stuff. I mean, it's pretty scary when you
it's
like,
scary,
okay,
yeah.
that's what he represents.
Well, as a cartoonist, I'll try to make amends.